I'm Amber Brock, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Amber Brock.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Author Stories. We really appreciate you listening. If you would like to subscribe to the show, over in the right-hand sidebar, there are some handy links where you can click and subscribe on your iPhone or your Google Android device, or listen online, or YouTube, or Stitcher Radio. Pretty much anywhere that you listen to podcasts, you can subscribe to Author Stories there. We would like to thank our sponsors today for sponsoring the show. It's because of their generous support that we're able to bring you so many great author interviews, and we'll be calling out those sponsors throughout the show. So thank you to them. As always, stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from our good friend Richard Gleaves. Thank you so much for listening. Now on to our show. He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl, well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe, listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together. And this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle. Available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Amber Brock on the show with me today. Amber has a brand new book out, just came out yesterday, and it's called Lady Be Good, and this is an awesome romp back to the 1950s, and I think you guys are really going to love it. It's a fantastic beach read. Welcome to the show, Amber.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.
Amber, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, I started writing, I think as most writers do, whenever I learned to write. I started putting together illustrated storybooks, and I think my mom still has a few of those hanging around somewhere, and, with my crayons and paper and a stapler, making my very first books. But I really got invested in writing at age 12, and I remember it really vividly and funny enough, it was a historical fiction piece that I had an idea for, and I read a ton, and I thought, I can do this. It takes a little dialogue, it takes a little narration, and so I sat down and wrote my very first story, and it was, I think, 30 notebook pages back and front, the good old wide-ruled middle school notebook paper.
Right.
And from there, I just started filling up notebooks with my words and my stories, and that's what I always called them, my stories. They were never really novel length, and I knew that in my heart, but I had by the time I went off to college, I had a moving box full of notebooks that I had filled up with stories. So it was a passion of mine from very early on.
So it was just never a question with you.
It really wasn't, and it was one of those things that it kind of came and went as our interests do, because once I went off to college, I was having to write papers, and I didn't have as much time to write the fun stuff, and then I went to graduate school and had even less time because the papers got considerably longer, and it really wasn't until I took a year off from teaching that I got back into writing, and it was like, forgive the cliche, but it was like riding a bike. I hopped right back on and started filling up, this time hard drives, not notes. So.
Right. Well, cliches are cliches for a reason. Everyone knows exactly what you mean when you say it was like riding a bike. That those muscles just may be a little sore from not using them, but they come back pretty quickly, don't they?
It's true.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you're a teacher, and you took some time off from teaching. What do you do? First off, are you still teaching now?
I am, yes. I teach at an all-girls school.
Nice. What do you teach?
So I started my career teaching high school Spanish, and then that was part of the reason why I left teaching for a year. I always had it in my heart to be an English teacher. I knew that's what I really, truly wanted to do as much as I loved teaching Spanish. And so I found a position teaching both English and Spanish. And now the majority of what I teach British literature and creative writing, but I do still pick up the occasional Spanish class because you never stop doing what you love.
Right. Were you teaching any sort of creative writing before you started novel writing again?
I wasn't. I didn't start. Actually, I wish I could take any kind of credit for the creative writing class at my school, but it was really one of the girls who pushed for it. We didn't have a creative writing class. We had performing arts and visual arts and music, but we didn't have any outlet for creative writers. And she knew that I was a writer, and so, but she wrote up the whole course proposal and did all of the research and presented to the curriculum cabinet, and then she said, and of course, if this gets approved, you're going to teach it, right? Because you're a writer. And so, how could I say no to that? So it was really, really one of my girls who made that a reality for me.
That is absolutely fantastic. As someone who had that desire from early on, I'm sure that your parents encouraged that, or maybe some teachers that you had. That there's always someone you can look back on that gives that little piece of encouragement, at just the right time, and they may not think that they did, but it sticks with you. Were your parents and teachers supportive of your? Oh,
for sure. Oh, I have a long list. How long do we have? I feel like I need to credit everyone, but I'm very grateful to my mom for never being suspicious or worried about the fact that I would spend just hours in my room with the door shut, and she trusted that I was writing and not doing something nefarious, and let me have that time and that space. So I'm really grateful. She's always been a big cheerleader for anything that I wanted to do. And we have a family friend, Anne, who was one of the first to read my teenage writings in my sort of later high school years. And she and a true confession, I did write a story about vampires. This was in the Anne Rice vampire popularity days, and she took my writing very seriously. She never made me feel like, oh, this is good for a kid. She always discussed it very seriously with me, and made me feel like I was really at work and not just playing. And then my beloved high school teacher, English teacher, who later became my mentor, Miss Rutledge. She was my creative writing teacher. She was my AP English teacher. She served, she was a school mom, a sounding board, and she also read what I wrote and took it seriously. And I think that's so important. That's something that I really try to do for my students, is to treat their writing is serious, and they are at work, and not to sort of pat them on the head and say, well, this is very nice for someone your age, because if you can encourage them to develop that talent, who knows where it'll take them.
As a teacher, when you look out and you see that same spark that others saw in you, and that same desire? Does that just give you the warm fuzzies all over?
It really does. It's so nice to pass that, the gifts that I've received along to my students, and to see just the different ways in which their talents develop, that it's so unique, it's so individual to each girl, and each girl has her own path to discovery, but it's such a joy to be able to mentor, to be able to pass along the lessons that I've learned, to hopefully spare them some of the skinned knees that I've had in falling on my journey, but also to be there for them when the going does get tough, and to be able to support them and in their journey.
So you mentioned that you took some time off from teaching, and this book idea came to you, or the idea to start writing again came to you. What was the story idea that grabbed your imagination?
So this was the first real novel that I had completed, real novel-length work of fiction that I had written and then took the time to edit. And it was, I'm a British literature teacher. I'm fascinated by European history and by royalty. I will freely admit to getting up early for several royal weddings. And so I read an enormous amount of nonfiction about European history. And I ran across the story of King Henri II of France, and he was married to Catherine de' Medici, of course, powerful Italian family. But the love of his life was a woman named Diane de Poitiers, and the story really stuck out to me. Of course, plenty of kings have mistresses, their royal mistresses. So he was married to Catherine de' Medici, obviously the powerful Italian family, and but he had a mistress, and many kings did. But what was unique is that he really seemed primarily devoted just to this one woman, Diane de Poitiers. And what really stuck out at me was that she had known him as a child, but their relationship actually began when he was 19 years old and she was 31. And so I thought that was such an unusual difference, especially for the time, especially for a king. And so I was really plagued by the question of why this particular woman, why was he so invested in her? And the answers to that question, and also the people around him who must have had that same question, ended up turning into a novel for me. And I wrote it from the perspective of several different people, from Henri's perspective and Diane's perspective. And it was a highly fictionalized version of their story, but it just held on to me, and I couldn't stop until I had written the whole story. So that was the first one that I completed.
Nice. What did you do with that book?
So actually, I have quite the rocky publishing road, but I edited it, and of course, a lot of beginning writers, I was no different, believe that you write a novel and then you send it to a publishing house, and then a month later you're signing your book at Barnes & Noble. And I did a little research and quickly discovered that that is not the case. And so in doing research, I realized that with my publication goals that I was really going to need an agent, and that required, of course, coming up with a query letter and researching agents and finding the right agent for me. And so I started sending out query letters, and the full manuscript is available if you would like to read it, and found out very quickly, of course, that most of them do not want to read it, and so quickly the rejection letters started piling up. But I just continued during that time to study books on writing craft, on editing. Of course, the classic self-editing for fiction writers became very well worn during that time, and just continued to polish and work with the manuscript until finally one day I got a response saying, yes, I'd like to take a look. And I started getting more of those responses, but was still getting rejections. And so I went online and actually found a critique group online. And one of the members of that group is still my writing buddy. We still trade manuscripts and trade emails actually most every day. and worked really hard with the feedback that I had gotten, and then started getting little snippets of feedback from some of the agents who were rejecting, and used that to try to make the manuscript the best it could be. And it caught the attention of an agent in London, and she eventually I did sign with her, and she took that novel to publishing houses, and it didn't sell. And so I by that point, because the best thing to do while you're waiting on all of those rejections is write more, write more novels, go ahead and get some more on that hard drive so that they're there for you when you need them. And so I was working on a story set in the medieval era, and I had an idea for a novel set in the 1920s, and I pitched that to her. And we had several conversations, and it just became clear that we had sort of different visions for my career going forward. She was so lovely to work with, and it was definitely an amicable split, but we decided to part ways. So I started at square one again, and I finished the medieval novel and then turned my attention to the 1920s story. And I wrote that one, and I wrote a draft really quickly, and then the school year started, so I gave myself some time off, and then went back and looked at it again, and I thought, this could be the one. This could be the one that gets me another agent, knowing full well that the odds were well against me. And so I really buckled down and did several rounds of editing and feedback with my critique partner, and then started sending out query letters again, knowing, and this time at least I knew what I was getting into. So, but of course, started racking up rejections way more than I was racking up requests, and every time I would take a break and take another look at the manuscript and say, is it as strong as it could possibly be, do editing work where I felt like I needed to. And then about 9 months into the process, I got an email from an agent, and she said, I would love to have a phone call with you. And my husband, he's so sweet, another of my biggest cheerleaders, he said, this is it. She's going to want to represent you. And I had been in the process long enough to know that might not be what the call was for, so I was cautiously optimistic. And so when I talked to her on the phone, she said, I love this story. I love this main character, but she's very cold. I feel like she holds people at a distance, and I feel like there's still some work to be done to make this novel the best it could be. And I said, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think I've taken it as far as I could go. If you have thoughts, about how to make it even better, I'd love to hear them. And she said, well, I think this is a woman who has a terrible secret in her past. I think she has made a terrible mistake that she holds on to, and it informs the way that she behaves in her relationships. It informs the way that she is with people. And if you wrote that into the novel, then I would love to take another look at it. And before she had finished speaking, I was, writing down notes, and I had this very clear vision. I said, yes, that's it exactly. So
that was very generous that was very generous of her to.
Oh, it was unbelievably generous of her. Very, very kind of her to do. And certainly, for an agent to take that kind of time with someone who's not a client, who, they're not representing yet, but to have that kind of faith that, you have a good start here.
Right.
You have something worth working with. I just will eternally be grateful to her for that. And and because out of that gratitude and excitement, I sat down over the course of 6 weeks at the start of school, which is no easy time. Any teacher can tell you. And I was on fire. The words were flowing out. And that novel eventually became A Fine Imitation, which was my debut, published in 2016. And it's a dual timeline novel, so it's set in 1913 and then 1923. And initially, I only had the 1923 story, but based on her notes and thoughts and suggestions, I wrote the 1913 storyline and then incorporated it into the existing novel and incorporated those characters into the 1923 storyline. And she was 100% right. I mean, it strengthened the novel in ways that I never could have foreseen. And so I sent her an email after I had polished and edited, and I said, I took your suggestions to heart. Here it is if you'd like to read it. And fortunately, she did not keep me waiting long. She gave me a call about a week later, and she said, you did exactly what I hoped you would do. Let's work on this novel together. And I signed with my agent. So I really do feel like I beat the odds twice.
I find it amazing that that when you switched gears and moved forward in time, still writing historical fiction, but writing the 1920s as opposed to the earlier stuff, that's when it, the great idea came, and then that eventually got you signed. Do you think about that much? What do you think? I think that happens a lot to a lot of us, that you think what it is that's going to be successful for you, but sometimes you just have to kind of clear all that out and let the right idea come. Do you ever think about that?
I do, and I think that so much of publishing and writing, I mean, even if you write just for yourself and not for publishing, it just requires such enormous patience. And I have not always been the most patient person. It has taught me patience in terms of just taking the time to get the story onto the page, taking the time to develop an idea and really work with it and make it the best it can be. And then in terms of, working with other people in publishing, and I wanted very badly for that first novel to be published, and it was not ultimately the right novel. It was not the right time, and that was a huge lesson for me, that I did need to write. I actually, A Fine Imitation was my fifth completed and polished manuscript, and I needed all of those to get to that point. And I think it can be really easy to lose sight of the joy of the process, of the joy of learning and discovering new things. And I think had that first one been published, been successful, it would have been sad. I never would have had the experience of writing the other ones. And I think that it's one of those things where if you jump into the river, it will guide you the right way, as long as you're willing to put the effort in and do the swimming. So, I needed to go along the entire path in order to get where I wanted to go. Can't jump off early.
Were all four unpublished novels similar genre?
Almost all of them. I did have one that was more of a romantic comedy. I love romantic comedies almost as much as I love history. So that was a little bit of a just for fun, just for me. But the other ones were all historical in nature. And and like I say, I have that one medieval novel that's hanging out waiting for medieval novels to become popular, which I might be waiting a while on that one, but I do love them all. They're all historical, but they're all pretty different.
Yeah, I find it interesting that even as a successful writer, you have to be careful of writing what's comfortable, and especially when you've had as much writing experience through your life as you have had. You think that the thing that just comes naturally is the thing that you would be the most good at, and sometimes you have to get uncomfortable and kind of open yourself up to the ideas that are hard to work on, and those things are the ideas that usually are really inspired, I've found.
Yeah, it's true. And I think that pushing yourself out of your comfort zone helps you to work harder. It helps you to improve your craft. You're not just spinning your wheels. You're not spending all of your time in a place that is familiar. And in branching out, that is where I have ended up doing some of my best writing and some of my most difficult edits was in embracing that discomfort, because I know very well as a teacher that the discomfort is where you're learning. If you're uncomfortable, it means you're in a new place. It means you're in undiscovered territory, and now it's time to map it. So, and funny enough, the most challenging writing experience I've had was Lady Be Good.
Well, that's where I was going next. A Fine Imitation was 1920s. Lady Be Good moves us forward about 30 or so years. Where did the idea for this book come from?
It was a combination of things. I listened to music, of course, on the way to and from work, and it's a very familiar commute, so I tend to let my mind wander a little bit. And I was listening to Annie Lennox's Walking on Broken Glass on my way to work. I'll never forget. And I just had this very clear image in my head of the character that would become Kitty Tessler. She just popped into my mind fully formed, and with the platinum blonde hair and the wicked smile, and she was ready to go, and I was ready to spend time with her and find out who she was. And then I was having a conversation with my agent, and she was regaling me with the stories of a socialite in New York who had, it may have been in Chicago, but who had grown up in a hotel. And that was really where the idea started. And this, such an unusual circumstance to be living in the penthouse of a hotel, and that was really where the idea came from. But I knew I wanted to write about a complicated protagonist. I knew I wanted her maybe to have some sharp edges, and I think that Kitty really does. She's not cuddly. She's not perfect and sweet. And I really wanted to dig into a character who has an enormous potential for growth and who makes a really big mistake. And ultimately that's what Kitty does. She has a good heart, but she lets her ambition and sometimes her lesser impulses drive her, and that leads her to a real moment of crisis. And I knew I could really have fun with that.
Do you feel that there's a thread of commonality in Lady Be Good and in your previous protagonist from your first book? I'm hearing a couple of little similarities, but do you connect these two protagonists at all?
Yeah, I think I'm really drawn to writing about people who are complex, who are very flawed.
Yeah.
I like to work with characters who have deep flaws and who make big mistakes, because I think that gives them a lot farther to go, and it makes their journey a lot more interesting. And Vera, and they're very different characters on the surface. Vera is very guarded. She is very mindful of her place in society. She's very careful about the things that she does and says, and she's very lonely, just deeply lonely. Whereas Kitty is bold, audacious, ambitious, and really loving, and has people in her life who she cares about fiercely and is very protective of them. Vera is holding everyone at arm's length, and Kitty is embracing the people who mean a lot to her. So on paper they look very different at first, but in the end I am absolutely drawn to a female protagonist who is flawed and who has a lot to wrestle with.
Well, I think we really like flawed, complex characters because most of us are flawed, complex people. And I think we like seeing other people go through adventures and through life, and we can connect to them. And when a character is not a Mary Sue, and she does have to deal with things, and she has to grow up a little bit, and she needs to be faced with things that are way outside of her perfectly painted life. I think that's why we like those, because we can see ourselves in those characters. Yeah,
it's certainly relatable for me. I know that, and we'd all love to imagine that, we're always making decisions that are in our best interest, and we always do the right thing and choose the right choice, but that is hardly ever the case. We all make mistakes and say, why did I do that? Why did I say that? That's really what Vera and Kitty have to struggle with. They're not always making the right choice. They're not always doing the right thing, and dealing with the fallout of that is where we find that growth. Is where we learn, okay, so that was wrong, and next time I'm going to do different. And I think Kitty especially has to wrestle with what she wants out of life, and part of that wrestling is inevitably for any of us, questioning what we've believed and questioning the choices that we've made.
How did you start researching the time period and some of the really important set pieces in this book? You've got this very privileged young lady who is in a very privileged but isolated in a lot of ways upbringing, and then you've got this whole adventure she goes on, which winds her up in Cuba of all places. And I find it really interesting. There have been 4 or 5 tremendous books over the last year that deal with the same time period in Cuba, and I don't believe there is author collusion going on, but I do find it interesting when these similar things start popping up, like there's something in our greater community conscious that we're thinking about these things. So how did you start researching this, and where did the different set pieces come from for you?
Yeah, I noticed that got a couple. I have noticed that some of those novels, and just great minds think alike.
Yeah, exactly.
all getting interested in it at the same time. But I think certainly a couple of years ago, when the travel restrictions were relaxed to Cuba, then it got everybody thinking about Cuba again, and Cuba's always been on my mind. And I studied a lot of Spanish-speaking cultures as part of my undergraduate and graduate degrees, and my graduate degree includes Spanish film, and I watched a lot of Cuban film in that study. So I've always had a special place in my heart for Cuba, despite never having been there. But and in New York, I will admit to already being a little bit comfortable with New York after writing A Fine Imitation, and interested in how the city had developed between 1923 and 1953. And it did seem like the perfect setting for a hotel magnate and his daughter, if he really is that savvy of a businessman and he's trying to establish himself with a series of hotels, then New York is such a natural place for him to start. And I say, New York is the city of wonders. You find something new and interesting every time I dive into the research on New York. So that was, that's always been a place of interest for me. But because A Fine Imitation was so restricted to New York, I didn't want to simply stay there this time. I wanted to expand and broaden and do some of that you were talking about, to reach out of my comfort zone. And so I thought, well, okay, so a really savvy businessman who's opening hotels and he wants to expand his business and reach outside of New York in, the 1930s, 1940s, where is he going to go? And in my research, I turned up information about Florida and how Florida's tourism industry changed from the sort of Gilded Age, and it was really just for the very wealthy who could afford to stay there for months at a time, to being more accessible and more of a possible tourist destination for people. And then when troops were stationed there during World War II, they fell in love with Miami. They were actually, a lot of them were stationed in the hotels that had come up on South Beach, and they fell in love with it. And then after the war ended, they started bringing their families there, and the tourism in Florida and especially Miami just exploded. So a really smart businessman would have been ahead of the curve on that and would have already established a place there. So that gave a great opportunity to get someone as sheltered as Kitty out of her comfort zone and move her to a place that she would be less familiar with, where she could experience some new things. And then in creating the band from Miami, of course it made sense to have a diverse band coming not just from Florida, but from several different places, Puerto Rico and Cuba, since there was some immigration going on during that time. And I created the Cuban character Sebastian, and he really sparked my imagination. I had so much fun spending time with him that it just felt like a natural connection to learn more about him and more about his family and experiences by taking the cast to Cuba. So spending that nice long weekend in Havana, like we would all like to, I'm sure.
Kitty really goes through some serious emotional growth in this book. Was it satisfying for you to take this character who, was a little bratty and privileged and spoiled, and to see her kind of come to grips with the world, with the realities of the world, as a writer, and you get to grow a character like that, that has to be very satisfying.
It really was. It truly was. And she does. She starts off being very difficult in a lot of ways, and the biggest challenge for me was to take the time to make sure that her growth was authentic and that it came out of her, that it wasn't that someone was going to sit her down and lecture her and tell her, well, now this is the way that things really are, and this is how you need to change, that it was all spurred on that it was an internal journey for her, that she made the choices, she made the mistakes, and then she learned from them in a way that changed her and in a way that helped her to see her world a little bit differently. And so part of that, of course, is in making the mistake, is in, this reckoning with who she really is and what she's done. But it carried on beyond that in a way that was fun and unexpected for me as I was creating it, and that she does, when she returns to New York, she has yet another sort of journey of self-discovery that's waiting for her there, and that opens her up to even more new possibilities, both for herself and for those around her. And,
we were talking earlier about those believable characters that we connect with that are a little complex and flawed. And that really, in growing your characters and keeping your characters believable, they really need to go through those moments of discovery where they have to figure it out. The lecture, like you mentioned, would not do anything for this character, and readers would have bailed ship immediately. But having her go through that authentic growth keeps her flawed story authentic all the way through the end.
Oh, thank you. I mean, my favorite characters inevitably are the ones that I would not want to have over for dinner. They're not people I would want to be friends with, but I will happily and willingly spend hours with them, precisely because I like to watch them transition. I like to watch them learn and grow and become the people that they should be. And I think that was ultimately my goal with Kitty, was that I wanted to give her that spark of potential in the beginning, even if she had some rough edges, even if she was a little tough, and then fan that spark into a flame and really let her become a better person, a more interesting person. And she's still got flaws. She doesn't, become perfect overnight. She doesn't learn everything all in one go, just like none of us do, and especially not in our 20s, as Kitty is. She's still very much at the beginning of learning about herself and learning about the world. But I know that one of my all-time favorite novels is I Know This Much Is True by Wally Lamb, and Dominic Birdsey, the main character. Boy, he is rough at the beginning. I mean, and really in quite a lot of ways throughout the novel, but it is so worth going with him for that last page and seeing who he becomes and seeing the transformation that he undergoes. And so I really took inspiration from that.
You live in Georgia now, right?
I do.
Are you from Georgia?
I'm from South Carolina. From
okay.
A small town in South Carolina. Yeah.
So you're from North Georgia? Yes. No. No.
Isn't that South Carolina? Georgia is South Carolina.
That's exactly
right.
right. That's exactly right. You write these stories based in New York and in Miami and Cuba and these great locations. Do you feel like, other than the South having the greatest literary tradition of all, do you feel like being from the South has impacted you or your writing in any way? Do you feel like that sense of place comes through in what you do?
I definitely hope so, and I do get asked frequently why I don't write about the South, and I do have several stories percolating that have Southern characters or that are actually set in the South. But one of the things that is so important for me whenever I'm creating the setting of a novel and creating the world of a novel is I actually like to have some distance from the reality of it so that doesn't color, so that the world of today, New York 2018, Havana 2018, doesn't color my view of it. I want to be able to see Havana 1953, New York 1923, without the interference of what does it look like today, what is the mood and attitude and vibe of today, and I think that helps me to be really successful. I use photographs, I use maps, but always from the era and films. In researching Lady Be Good, I found just an unbelievable number of home movies on YouTube. People, in the 50s and 60s, actually even earlier too, traveling through Florida with their little video cameras, and they're just filming. And I'm sure they thought nobody but the family was ever going to watch those movies. But it helps me to be steeped in the world as it was, as opposed to thinking of South Beach the way that it is today. But certainly being Southern informs the way that I think about settings and home and what do those things really mean. And in A Fine Imitation, Vera's home is a central part of the story, and this question of where do you feel like you belong is a very important one for her. And then with Kitty, living in such an unusual situation, living in a hotel the way that she does, she already is a little bit displaced. She has a home that has strangers coming in and out every day, and she doesn't really think about that. So I think a little bit of my Southern experience is able to bleed through in that way, that home is always very important for my characters, and it's always something that question of where do you belong, because I certainly feel like I belong in the South.
I love that answer. The book is called Lady Be Good. It's out now. This is a fantastic character-based look into historical, a true historical time, and with wonderful characters. Amber, if people are just learning about you and wanting to find out more, maybe get into your other works, where can they find you online?
So my website is amberbrock.net. Try to keep it easy. And I'm on Twitter and Instagram. On both of those, I am Brock Writes, AMBROCK Writes. And I'm also on Facebook, so try to be highly available. But on Facebook, it's /Amber Brock Writes.
Awesome. The thing you mentioned a minute ago about YouTube, I have never thought about looking for people's old home movies. I think everybody's writing that down right now. That is such a fantastic idea. I am going to steal that and use it. Amber, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Welcome to historic Sleepy Hollow, settled in 1640. Jason had looped around the town and had come up Broadway from the south. Behind the retaining wall next to the sign, a yard worker turned on his leaf blower, sending a tidal wave of yellow and red up and over the stones to splash off the windshield of the RV. They passed antique shops, a Shell station, and a Food King grocery. "This is the same Broadway, you know," said Eliza. "It goes all the way down to Times Square. Used to be an Indian trail, Manhattan to Fort Orange, for the fur trapping business." She kissed the dog. "Oh, don't worry, baby. Nobody's gonna skin you. And you know what the town's most famous for?" "Well, duh," Jason said. Every kid named Crane, especially one as tall and skinny as Jason, had heard a lifetime of Ichabod jokes. He hoped never to hear another. "Did you know it was a real place?" "Of course," he said, though he hadn't. "Don't be so smart," said Eliza. "Turn here." The streets sloped towards the Hudson, the hillside trying to shake the village off its back. Jason slipped in behind a UPS truck and drove upwards. They turned onto Gory Brook Road. He stuck his head out the window, trying to pass. The UPS truck turned aside to the right. And he saw the house. Here, said Eliza. She pointed at the driveway of 417 Gory Brook. Jason brought the RV to a smoke-belching halt. The house stood on a knoll, above a steep yard that angled downwards toward the Hudson. An ancient sycamore on the front lawn leaned precariously. The roof was an irregular A-frame, with a long slope on the left and a short one on the right, like a rotated checkmark. The upper floors were trimmed with bands of chocolate-brown wood in a rectangular pattern. They made the house look as if it were trapped behind the bars of a jail cell. A tiny triangular portico extended over the front door, which was rough-hewn, rounded on top, held together by two vertical metal bands, and dotted with nail heads. A Gothic novel in Braille. The gray-blue curtains at the ground floor bay window gave the place a veiled eye aspect, like his grandmother's cataracts. The house seemed to be inspecting Jason with that eye. "What are you doing here, boy?" "I'm watching you." Eliza put a hand on his shoulder. He jumped. "This is it," she said. She slapped the dashboard. "This is what?" "Our new home." "But—" Jason turned to her, baffled. Her face sparkled with delight. "Surprise!